Hello, I'm Dr Manjir and welcome to Hidden Science. The near-death experience is one of the most controversial issues in science. Many people have reported having experiences whilst in a coma or being resuscitated that seem to suggest that consciousness exists beyond the brain. Skeptics say these experiences are no more than the misfirings of neurons deprived of oxygen. But what will our guests decide? My first guest today is Dr Penny Sartori. After 17 years as an intensive care nurse in the NHS, Dr Sartori went from skeptic to being scientifically open after researching NDEs for 8 years, earning a PhD from the University of Wales. She's published both a milestone scientific study and a popular book on the subject called The Wisdom of the Near-Death Experience, which has been featured in the Daily Mail. Welcome to the show, Penny.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
Now, you used to be a skeptic, or you didn't really know much about NDEs as they're known, when working as an intensive care nurse. So what exactly happened?
Well, I think doing my research really has made me more open to we don't really have an explanation for these experiences. And I think the fact that I did 8 years then as doctoral research has really made me realise that no matter how we look at near-death experiences, there's not one common theme or one explanation for them. You know, they're not just the case of going through a tunnel towards a bright light. It's a highly complex phenomenon, and there's lots of after effects that go with these experiences as well. So I think we have to do far more research. There's not enough research that's been done, really. If you think about the research that has been done, a lot of it is anecdotally reported. And I think we get the best research when we're able to study these in the hospital setting, because we can check what the patients are saying, and then we can check the medical notes, and we can verify certain aspects of these experiences as well. So I think a lot more research certainly needs to be done in this area.
So they really have to be what's known as prospective studies, where you're going forward rather than looking backward.
Yes.
But I'm quite interested in what got you into this in the first place. Was there a particular patient? Because intensive care is quite as it sounds, an intensive place to work. So.
Yes, it is, and it was very early on in my career as an intensive care nurse, and I was looking after a man on a night shift, and he was clearly dying. He knew he was dying, but we were doing everything we could to keep him alive. And this night shift, I was just doing some routine nursing care, and as I adjusted the electric bed to put him flatter, the man nearly jumped out of bed in agony. And at that point, our eyes sort of connected. And it's almost as if I'd swapped places with him, and I could understand what he was going through and what he was feeling. And he was mouthing to me. He couldn't talk because he had a tracheostomy, and he was mouthing, "Leave me alone, let me die in peace." And that just really shocked me. Up until that point, I always thought I'm just saving lives and I'm doing really good. But when I had that experience with that patient, I really thought, wow, we just don't understand death at all. And so the whole of that night shift, I was thinking about this. And the following day, it was something that upset me really deeply. I got home from work and I couldn't sleep. I phoned work mid-morning and they said, "Oh, he died about 2 hours after you left." And that really changed things for me. And so I tried to find some nursing courses that would help me to deal with this, but there was nothing available. It was all palliative care, which is a very different approach to people in critical care areas. So I started reading about death. And then I came across near-death experiences, and I thought, oh, now this is really interesting. These people are saying that they've died and that it's a lovely experience. And I thought, wow, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, maybe there's something in this. But I think because my scientific training as a nurse, it made me quite skeptical, really. And I think I'd always been led to believe that these were just hallucinations. And the more I read about them, the more curious I became. And I just thought, well, I'm working in an ideal area now, so perhaps I can research them further. And so that's what I did. And I was able to research them then for my doctorate. So.
Oh gosh, from just that one patient then, you had really the humanity to go forward, because having worked in critical care and acute medicine myself, I know how difficult it is to keep a hold of the humanity when you're working with patients. So from that, you really got scientifically curious about the near-death experience, and you went on to do your PhD, this 8-year study. What were the aims of that study? What were you really looking into there?
Well, the aim of the study was to find out if near-death experiences could teach us anything about the dying process, because I think we know very little about the dying process itself, and that was the main aim. Sometimes it gets sort of sidetracked, and a lot of people have misconceptions that it's all about life after death, but it's never been about that. It's all about trying to find out if we can learn something about the dying process so that patient care can be enhanced. And that was the primary goal of my research, and that's what continues to drive me to this day. It's something that I think we really do need to be aware of, and so that it can benefit future patient care as well.
So it really isn't about sort of anything esoteric as such, or it didn't start out with it. It's really about patient care, so that we can actually understand what people are going through, so that we can look after them better. So in the case of this study, you actually had to interview people who've had near-death experiences. Did you find anyone who you said that not all of them are the same, but are there any particular features that people sort of do report?
Yeah, they follow a set pattern, and with the research that I did, the most common component was meeting deceased relatives or friends, and very often the relatives and friends said, no, it's not your time, you have to go back. Some patients reported that their relatives were quite angry to see them, and they were like, you shouldn't be here, go back for those children, and saying things like that, and the patients didn't understand why their relatives were so angry. Some people had out-of-body experiences. Some people did go through the tunnel. Some people saw light. And very often these things are quite life-changing for the patients as well. But I think the most important thing that I realised is that patients don't understand them. And it's such an overwhelming experience for them that they want to share the experience, but they're afraid to as well, because they think, well, perhaps people are not going to believe me, people are going to think I'm mad. In the 8 years research, I had 15 patients who had the experience, and out of those, only 2 of them volunteered the information. And those were very deep experiences where they had a lot of the components. For example, the first man reported having an out-of-body experience. He went into a pink room where he met his dead father, met a Jesus-type figure, sent him back to life. And they had such a big impact on these patients that they wanted to share them with everyone else. But I found with the other 13 patients, they would never have spoken about it had I not asked if they had any memories of the time that they were unconscious. But having spoken about it, they were relieved that they were able to speak about it, and that I didn't think that they were mad.
Gosh, that's a huge proportion, really. So it's bad enough that they've gone through this trauma, and then they have a memory that they're afraid to speak of. So yeah, it sounds like there's a huge amount to get. Whether or not you believe that anything's really going on, just to allow people to speak about what they've experienced is a huge case to go forward. Are there? So you mentioned about particular changes in people's lives that people have. I've heard about people coming back from this sort of experience and actually knowing how to play piano where they've never been able to before. Did you come across anything like that? Any sort of real life-changing things that people went through? I
didn't come across that particular aspect in the research that I did in the hospital, but since then I have come across people who've had this kind of, gained this kind of knowledge, This time last year I was at a conference in Marseille in France, and I met a lady there called Raja Ben-Amour. And she had this very deep and intense near-death experience that went back. She had a life review back to the whole of her life, but she also went back to the birth of the universe. And following her near-death experience, she now has this in-depth knowledge of quantum physics. Now, that's something she'd never studied before. She just had the basic education in school. But now she's been motivated to go to the university and study it at university level. And the interesting thing in this conference is that they had a university professor, and he said, I don't really understand how she can have this knowledge, because this is deep-seated knowledge acquired over many years of study. It's not something that you can acquire through reading books or doing a booster course. And he said further to that, some of the things that she's written about, not even he understands, it's beyond his level of understanding, but it's been confirmed in publications in physics journals since then.
Right.
So that's something that we just can't understand.
That's pretty dramatic, isn't it? Having that sort of knowledge. And I have heard of another case of that, where a woman came back, no scientific knowledge, and she could impress all the physicists. So, are there any cases that you've come across where someone is having what they're calling an out-of-body experience from a scientific perspective? We can't really say that that's definitely, but that's what they're perceiving, that they're actually seeing their body, their physical body from some other vantage point, and that there's something that they see which from their physical body they couldn't have known because they're in a coma, but they're able to report back, say like a doctor arriving at the door or something like that. Has there been anything to you that's been particularly compelling of that nature?
Yes, there was one case in my study which is the strongest case, and this is of patient 10, and I was actually there looking after him on this day, and we'd sat him in the chair. He was making quite a good recovery, and to help with his recovery you sit them in the chair. It helps with the muscle tone and with their posture for the breathing. He was still ventilated at the time. Shortly after sitting in the chair, I noticed his breathing pattern had changed. The monitor started to alarm, and so I gave him some extra oxygen with an ambu bag, squeezed it in through his tracheostomy, and that resolved. But then his blood pressure started to drop. He went into a very fast heart rhythm very briefly, and he went cold and clammy, and I thought if I don't get him back to bed, he'll have a cardiac arrest in the chair. So I called my colleagues, someone else was on the phone calling the doctor, and within minutes we got him back into bed. But by this time he was deeply unconscious, not responding to deep painful stimuli or for me calling his name. The doctor came, we gave him some fluid which resolved his blood pressure temporarily. The doctor went, but his blood pressure started to drop again. So my colleague kept an eye while I went off to find another doctor, and at that particular point the consultant walked into the unit. So I said, quick, come and see my patient. He came and examined him, shone a pupil torch in his eyes, and we give him some more fluid for his blood pressure, and then his condition stabilised, so the consultant was happy about that and returned to his office. Now in the meantime he dribbled from the side of his mouth, so I cleaned up his mouth, and the physiotherapist who'd sat him in the chair with me was quite concerned. She kept poking her head around the curtains, coming back to check on him. And after 30 minutes then, he started to flicker his eyelids and move his limbs. So they're all signs that he's regaining neurological function. So I'd pulled the screens back around at that point. And then about 3.5 hours later, he regained full consciousness as the ward round were approaching his bed area. And he was really excited. He was trying to tell them something. So the physio got a letterboard and he spelled, "I died and I watched it from above." And he pointed to the consultant as the person who had examined him, pointed to the physio and described her poking her head around the curtains, and he also described me cleaning his mouth.
So he was in a coma whilst all this was going on?
Yeah, he was deeply unconscious.
And he described watching this?
Yes, from above, yes. And further to that, he said he also went into a pink room where he met his dead father, his dead mother-in-law, who we'd never met but recognised from photographs.
Right.
And also a man, he said, I'm not sure who he was, could have been Jesus, but it's not what I expect Jesus to look like, because he had long, scruffy hair that needed a good comb in. And he said he was very drawn to look at his eyes as well. And then his father was calling him, and he wanted to go and stay with his father, but the Jesus figure said, no, it's not your time, you have to go back. And he said the image faded and he sort of drifted backwards into his body, and as soon as he was back in his body he was in immediate pain.
Right, so he didn't feel that pain at all, and
not
then
when he was out of this.
Suddenly shocked into that pain.
Yes, that's right. But there's an interesting aspect of this case as well. This man is 60 years old and he has cerebral palsy.
Right.
So his right hand is in a permanently contracted position.
Right.
Now when I was interviewing him, he misunderstood my question, and I said, is there anything you can do when you're out of your body you can't normally do? And he said, oh yeah, look, I can open my hand out.
Oh my goodness, that is amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much for that story. We're going to go more into the science of NDEs and the skeptical approach as well soon. But we've got to go for a break now, so join us again for more hidden science of NDEs. Hello and welcome back to Hidden Science, where we're discussing the near-death experience. My next guest is Graham Nichols. He is an author, artist and expert on OBEs, having experienced and researched them since 1987. He's taken part in research experiments with Dr Rupert Sheldrake, supported by the University of Cambridge, and is a partner member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He's written 2 books about his experiences, including Avenues of the Human Spirit. And welcome to the show, Graham.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've been having these interesting experiences since a young age. So how did it all start for you?
Well, my initial ones happened spontaneously when I was around 12. I was just laying down one evening, just relaxing, and suddenly I found myself out of my body. There was no real sensation of leaving or anything like that. I just found myself out of my body and in a vertical position, almost like I was floating a few feet, but like standing in the air essentially. And I had a few occurrences of this over the next few weeks, and that was the beginning really. I then heard about the idea of out-of-body experiences I think I saw it in an article or something like that. And then I went out and got a book by a parapsychologist called Janet Lee Mitchell. And then I studied it and I learned to induce them myself, basically. And then it was like the floodgates opened and I started having more and more experiences after that.
Oh gosh, so you've been sort of doing it on demand, as it were?
Mostly, yeah. It was just those very, very first experiences that were spontaneous.
Right, right. So from having these OBs, these out-of-body experiences, you've also researched the near-death experiences too. How do you think that the two are related?
Well, as Penny mentioned, I think the out-of-body experience is an aspect of many near-death experiences. So I think it's something that happens within that context. And the types of experiences I've had are very similar to what people describe in the near-death state. I have had dark tunnel, for example, that classic theme. I've also had the thing of looking down at myself from above, although many of my experiences now tend to happen away from my physical body altogether, or I might be in a completely different position. But all of the classic features of what you would say are in there in a near-death experience I've had at some point through my out-of-body experiences, so I think they're very closely linked.
So just as Penny was saying, that some people can actually pick up on things that they shouldn't be seeing ordinarily. Have you had that too? Have you seen sort of maybe even events or places that in your physical body you've not been to or seen?
Yeah, well, initially I was, I wouldn't say skeptical, but I was kind of neutral. I didn't know whether I believed it or not.
Even though you were experiencing it, you didn't know if you believed it?
Yeah, I had the experiences, and I guess the natural thing would be to assume that it was some kind of hallucination or dream or something like that. So I was looking for an experience that would give me a clue on what was going on in that sense. And the first real experience I had like that was one where I was in London, not far from where I grew up, and I went off of Bayswater Road and I went into the top floor of a terraced house and was able to read some details on some like letterhead paper, like business letterheads. And then I was also able to see the West 11. That was the postcode on the side of one of the streets. So by bringing those two elements together, I then went to the phone book. This is pre-internet. So I went to the phone book, looked up the name that I'd read and also the postcode, and I found that there was a person in that location who all the details matched. And then I retraced my route on foot and found that the building matched as well. So that was the first experience that I had that really verified that they could be objective. And then since then I've had many experiences, including ones that have been witnessed by other people when I had the out-of-body experience, so sort of confirming what I said and things like that.
So you've really taken a scientific approach to your own experiences?
As much as possible, yeah.
Sort of testing them out and see if there's anything that could be corroborated?
Yeah, yeah.
Right, so it sounds similar to the way that people are describing the near-death and the out-of-body experience with the NDEs as well. But there's another aspect. I mean, have you ever felt in danger when you're going out there? Because not all NDEs, for example, are pleasant, are they? People sort of describe things that aren't so pleasant when they're sort of in a different state.
Yes, a small percentage have hellish-like experiences, yeah. But personally, no, I haven't had anything like that. They've all been either physical in the sense that they've been on this kind of level, this kind of type of reality, or they've been in some kind of other level, whatever that might be. And in those kinds of other levels, it's all been very much positive and beautiful scenery and colours and things like that, very vivid. Again, very much like what's described in near-death experiences. Almost like the summer lands that you hear described in some traditions and things like that. So yeah.
So how is this different from, I know we did a show on lucid dreaming before, so what's the difference between what you're experiencing and a lucid dream, for example?
Well, I think they're very different, especially in my case, in the sense that they don't happen when I'm asleep is the most obvious difference. I think I've had about 2 or 3 in my entire life, and I've had probably more than 1,000 out-of-body experiences. So there's that difference. Then there's things like the kind of psychological stuff that often happens in dreams. I don't get that in the out-of-body experience. It's much more objective, much more just like this kind of reality, but you're experiencing it through some kind of extended mind or extended consciousness of some description. And colours and things like that can be different, but it's more like there's a difference to the visual field. It's not like something that's not there is come into the experience. So I think really they're just more objective than dreams and not as malleable and all of those kinds of things. Okay. So it's a different state.
Now you mentioned extended mind. I mean, you've done some scientific studies with Rupert Sheldrake. What were they about? Can you tell us about those?
That started from, I initially contacted him and we met up a few times, and he was interested in the work I was doing with immersive structures, which is another area I look at, using technology to enhance these kinds of experiences. And he had some criticism from skeptics on the grounds that people could have potentially been using mobile phones or some kind of device like that. So we came up with the idea of doing the tests in a place that would be shielded from mobile phones, so basically like an underground bunker essentially. So we found a place like that in East London. We went there, we set up a series of telepathy experiments. And we also used a special device that cancels out any kind of phone signals or anything like that. So we really made it tight so that no one could cheat.
So you were really sort of testing these types of techniques.
Yeah. And we basically got the same kinds of results that he gets when he does his experiments in other contexts.
And that was a study that's supported by the University of Cambridge, is that right?
That was part of his Perrott Warwick research when he was the director of that, from Cambridge.
So in your opinion, with everything, that you take a sceptical approach almost to your own and scientific approach to your own experiences, but now that you've been through these many years of experimenting in your own way, do you feel as if a consciousness really can exist beyond the brain, that there's something more than the physical brain?
For sure. I think the veridical elements, the factual objective things that you find while in those kinds of experiences, you see that in near-death research, you see that in the out-of-body experiences, and you see that in other areas as well, like the kind of research Rupert Sheldrake does. So I think when you bring all of that together, there's a kind of convergence of evidence that you can't just say, oh, there's nothing to consciousness being extended or having other elements to it. I don't claim to know exactly how that all works, etc. And I think that we have to also move away from just assuming the esoteric frameworks, that it must be an energy body or it must be all these different ideas that have been there historically. I think we need to kind of be open-minded to what the possibility could be there. So that's really where I want to go. I'm kind of, is it some kind of energy body? Is it an extended mind? Is it that consciousness exists the whole time outside of the body and that we receive it in some way, as some people have proposed? So I'm open to what the solution might be, and I think we just need to keep researching and exploring it more, really.
Okay, brilliant. We're going to talk about more of the scientific studies later. But really, you're for moving towards the science. We've got enough of these studies now to move to a new science and a new description, really, just to keep our minds open, having done all the sort of research that yourself, Dr. Sartori, has done. Okay, so we're going to go for a break now. So join us again for more on the near-death experience. welcome back to the show. My next guest today is Jaz Rasool, who graduated both in physics and molecular biology from the University of London, before going on to study Chinese medicine, business coaching and much more. He's also the inventor of the award-winning Energy Diamond software. So welcome to the show, Jaz. Good to have you back again.
Thank you, Manjir. Pleasure to be here.
Great to get your physicist perspective on the whole subject of NDEs, because there's been a lot of talk on the internet recently about someone who's been called a physicist is actually a stem cell researcher called Dr. Robert Lanza. Now, he's saying that quantum physics can actually prove there's life after death. What do you think about that?
Well, I think his work, which basically says that the universe is the way it is because life designed it that way, I think is an interesting concept, because if that's the case, then it means that even after a physical body dies, then there's life that's still taking care of what's no longer there. And when I studied quantum physics, I realized some really simple things that relate to Robert's work. Mathematically, when you describe anything in the universe, there's a real part and there's what's called an imaginary part. And this is the actual maths of quantum physics. And I always wondered, well, when the real part disappears, what happens to the imaginary bit? And I began to realize it must still exist somewhere. And it might not be in a physical form, but it must exist perhaps in another dimension, mathematically
things
at
like
least.
the square root of -1
That's
and things
right,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yes.
So quantum physics has two components to describe everything we see in the universe. And when the physical component, like a body, dies and it's no longer functioning, then the other component, which is to do with stuff that's not material, that's not in the real world as we know it, but is nevertheless part of the universe, it still exists. So the question is, where does it go? And it doesn't go anywhere, actually. It's still there, but we don't observe it in our normal physical measurements through medical instruments or through our physical senses.
Right, so what have you studied this at all, Dr. Sartori?
I've not looked at this theory much, no, so I don't know a great deal about that aspect of it. But yes, what you're saying certainly does tend to make sense, because when patients have these experiences and meet deceased relatives, for example, and things like that, you know, how can we explain these things? Because sometimes they get communications from these relatives that they couldn't have known about as well. So,
yeah. And that's what you've studied in your PhD.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, brilliant. And so do you think that, as Dr. Lanza is saying, that the double slit experiment in quantum physics has got anything to do with NDEs?
Well, interesting thing is, when I was studying acupuncture, one of the big things that was of interest to me was, in acupuncture there was these lines of energy called meridians, but you can't physically observe those in the body like blood vessels, but they nevertheless, according to the Chinese, still exist. And I wondered, well, what could they be? And I began to look at the possibility that the electrical currents that run along nerves that exist in the circulatory system, they all generate their own electrical and magnetic fields. And there are these places in between one blood vessel and another blood vessel, one nerve cell and another, where those fields mix and they interfere with each other. And I wondered whether these places where these peaks of interference occur, whether they actually corresponded to these interesting invisible, meridian lines. And it was at that point that I began to realize, well, maybe it doesn't just happen between nerves and other nerves. Maybe it happens in the brain. Maybe it happens between one neuron and another. And the real consciousness that we experience isn't in the neurons, it's in the space in between where the fields of the neurons actually mix with each other. Which means when the neurons die or they're not functioning anymore, the question is, does that field in between, does it still exist? And I have every suspicion that it does. And that means that our consciousness isn't simply down to our neurons, it's down to the residual field that comes as a result of interference of their respective electrical and magnetic fields.
So just like you get the interference patterns and the wave particle duality in the double slit experiment, you're actually getting that within the brain as well. So it's almost like consciousness inhabits the brain And so it's beyond the neurons, because no matter what we do, neuroscience actually can't discover how consciousness arises, so how we actually have an inner experience. So there's all sorts of interesting explanations for near-death experiences out there, which is, we don't know the first thing about consciousness to start off with. But there was another theory, because I know you've got a bit of an astrophysics background as well, and it was published in the Noetic Sciences Journal by Dr Maureen Venselar, I hope I've got her name right, and she's comparing the tunnel that's seen by many people in NDEs to a wormhole that we hear about in cosmology. Do you think there's any link between these concepts?
My heart of hearts, I totally believe that actually is a very significant factor in NDEs, because many years ago I was looking into the brain, and at the time there was some material produced by physicist Roger Penrose, an anaesthesiologist, Stuart Hammeroff. And of course, anaesthesiologists, they help people work losing their consciousness all the time, so they're very interested in the parts of the body that do that through anaesthetics. And what they proposed was that gravity, the gravitational field that we're immersed in, the way that it acts on our neurons, it actually leads to the output of consciousness, our thoughts, our feelings and awareness. But what I realised at the time was that biological processes are reversible. They go both ways. This means our thoughts, our feelings acting through the brain can actually influence gravitational fields. Now, things that we normally associate with gravity, things like space, time, wormholes, things like that, that means our consciousness, if that's the case, that we can influence gravity through our brain, it has the possibility of doing two things. It can receive information from across space and time, and it can also transmit information across space and time. That opens the possibility of our consciousness having access to other areas of space and time, what they call remote viewing, or even having precognition, where we're seeing things in the future. And that singular responsibility of how consciousness and gravity work with one another is very much like how electricity and magnetism work with each other. They're actually complementary forces that in a unified way, magnetism can be used to generate electricity. Electricity can be used to generate magnetism. And I believe consciousness and gravity have the same complementary relationship. Consciousness can be used to shift gravitational fields, but also shifts in gravitational fields can influence consciousness.
Well, really, if you're looking for a theory of everything, then it has to include consciousness. So the physicists that are looking for that. So, why can't consciousness be related to gravity? It should be if we're really looking for a
they've got very
one
similar
force.
properties.
Yes.
Like for example, when
someone's space and time.
when someone's in a very intense state of consciousness, they tend to have an altered sense of space and time. For example, when you're in love or when you're in a state of meditation. But people are known to have interesting effects in near-death experiences, which are to do with their watches, for example. They find their watches don't function, or something happens in terms of their physical experience of time.
Have you found this, Graham, in your adventures?
I have noticed some effects on electrical things, and I think Penny has in her work as well, so there does seem to be something to that.
Yeah,
for sure.
certainly, and people often they don't associate this electrical sensitivity that they develop with being as part of their near-death experience as well.
Yeah, gosh, there's something else that, sorry, I've got to mention it again because it really interests me to do with my work that she's mentioned. And she says that people who have NDEs, this lady who's published this paper, she's actually said that they have a sort of double funnel, which interests me because of my work in black holes. So, I talk about this dual funnel and everything. So is that something that you come across in your studies, that people who have NDEs are seeing this sort of double vortex?
No, one man in my hospital study described being sucked upwards in like a vortex of air, but that's the closest really I've kind of come across.
Right.
I've had a very definite tunnel that seemed to have sparks of, almost like if you were grinding metal, those kinds of sparks coming off it, so it looked like darkness, but then with all this light coming in a sort of spiral around it. So, but it's not a common feature. The experiences tend to be more almost like phasing to another location. So it's almost like literally a switch from one signal to another, and you're in a completely different location.
Oh gosh, that's amazing. No, I just was thinking because my work on black holes is about the same principle happening at every single level, and so you've got this sort of double spiral happening. So it's quite interesting that people are reporting that. So we're going to go to another break now. So join us again, and we'll be discussing more about the hidden science of the near-death experience. Welcome back. Now, Penny, there's a lot of skepticism about the near-death experience, where people really don't believe that anything is happening. What are the main skeptical arguments that people talk about?
Well, a lot of people say that they're quite logical arguments. It's due to lack of oxygen or due to high levels of carbon dioxide in the blood, due to the drugs that we give to the patients. And, those are my thoughts as well when I first started studying these. But I found with my research that those arguments weren't really supported by what I found with my research. So, for example, patients described these experiences without having had any drugs. Some of them described having had a near-death experience when they were fully oxygenated, because at the time they were ventilated, and we took off blood gas samples and their blood gases were normal. And so those sort of theories were not really supported by the research that I found in the clinical area. Although they're quite logical to explore, they weren't supported.
So these people aren't really clinicians, they're not really on the ground that are taking all the studies. There's even been some cases where people have had actually no EEG activity whatsoever, and yet they're still reporting things that are verifiable later on. What do you think of that? I mean, there's people that are trying to denigrate even these experiences.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't really know the full extent of near-death experiences, what they are. It's such a highly complex phenomenon with lots of other after effects and changes as well. So it's not just a case of going through a tunnel, leaving your body, and maybe perhaps it's a mind model created by the brain. It's something far more because of the long-term changes as well. And very often the patients don't like these changes that go with them as well.
Right, sometimes it can change their lives in a different way that they don't like.
Yeah. There could be high divorce rate as well because of the changes that they go through.
Because people have changed so dramatically. There's even a study in Belgium that I was reading about, which is the recall of near-death experiences is the memory is much stronger than any other type of memory.
Absolutely, yes. It's really etched in the mind of the person who's had the experience. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a letter from a lady, and she had an experience in her childhood, and she's now in her 90s, and she said it's just as vivid now as if it happened 2 minutes ago.
Right, and people are starting to study that scientifically. There's also been a study in the Lancet, hasn't there?
That's right, yes, Dr Pim van Lommel, and that was published in 2001. And again, with his research, it showed that these experiences clearly happen in the clinical area. He had a really great report of an out-of-body experience that had components verified as well by one of the nurses there. And again, there were long-term changes in his patients. He followed them up after 8 years and found very many long-term changes.
And that was a prospective study, wasn't it?
That's
so it wasn't sort of self-selected after the fact. That was actually going forward. Now, Graham, there's been some really high-profile cases of near-death experiences with Anita Rajani and Eben Alexander. Do you think, and these books are really bestsellers in many, many different countries. Do you think there's like a change in public consciousness right now?
I think the public's always been interested in these things, really. I do think it's becoming more known in some ways, but then at the same time, some of the sceptical arguments that we mentioned get a lot of press as well. So people tend to believe that they've been solved, that people know what's going on, when in actual fact, the data doesn't really support a lot of these plausible explanations, but not really backed up by the data. So I think there's a shift in awareness to some degree, but it's always kind of a back and forward between the actual data and those who just want to say there's nothing to it.
Yeah, but with that, Jazz today is just really, you've said so much that it's really made us think. I mean, it seems to be that just an interdisciplinary approach of taking the physics and taking the biochemistry, and there's very rarely people who are sort of versed in so many areas as Jazz is, that, so where do you see the research going, do you think? Where do you think we should focus?
Well, interestingly, I was at a meeting with people from the RSA a couple of days ago, which is the Royal Society of Arts, and they're interested in how to communicate spirituality more effectively out into society in a way which isn't too woo-woo, but is actually practical and meaningful. And I think actually we need to be looking at near-death experiences in a similar kind of way. We need to look at how is it useful for helping people grow as human beings and improve how they relate to one another. And fundamentally that comes down to looking at what is it within NDE that can support an individual, what stretches them and challenges them, and maybe even what gives them pause to reflect. If we can start looking at NDEs not just from a clinical perspective, but then look at the benefits of how it might transform a person, then we've got the possibility of not looking at it as some weird little side effect, but actually something which is constructive that a person can use to advance and evolve themselves.
Wow, so we really need to do a lot more. So you would take the more humanitarian approach, really. And Penny is saying exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
It's like at the end of the day, it comes from caring for people. To actually acknowledge these experiences exist. Then.
Yes.
So where do you suggest that people go to find more?
Read the literature for a start. There's loads of books out there on near-death experiences, but most importantly, speak to people who've had the experience. Really get in touch with these people and hear what they're saying, because they have a really important message for us.
Yes. So I'm just holding up your book there. So wonderful book. I found it, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, a really good read, because you're giving your experience as a person as well as the actual scientific research as well.
I think we do need to also look at the science as well. If people are reporting these experiences and we possibly can understand them by looking at the relationship between consciousness and gravity, then we need to start building instruments or processes which allow us to measure that relationship. James Clerk Maxwell, great physicist, he unified electricity and magnetism together into electromagnetic theory. And I think it's probably time for us to see what would happen if we did unify our knowledge on consciousness and gravity together. Would we come up with something which would help us actually get the two to visibly, measurably interact with each other?
Well, I'm sure you're going to come up with the equations in the next few years. It just seems on the tip there. So, why not? We're talking about unity in science all the time. And, when we talk about electricity like 100 years ago, these were nebulous forces. So we're at another sort of turning point.
There's many crossovers, I think. And there's data now showing non-locality or entanglement between neurons. There's so much data that's suggesting that maybe it is something akin to Jung's collective unconscious or something of that nature, like a larger conscious framework, and we can access that information through something like an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience. And I think the OBE that we can have from a completely healthy condition can give us these same experiences of interconnectedness, of empathy with other people, because we don't feel so separate from them, because we have that direct experience of connection.
People are yearning for this. People want to feel something beyond. And so I'm sure that you have workshops soon, don't you, to help people. Where can people find out more about this?
I have a workshop coming up on the 15th of March, and I also coach people and teach these kinds of things through Skype and one-on-one, because I think that's a really good way to teach as well.
Oh, excellent. So you basically can teach people all over the world. They don't have to be
anywhere,
in person.
yeah.
And what's your website? Where can people find out more?
It's grahamnichols.com, and that's Nichols with 2 L's.
Okay. And yourself, Jazz? Find out more about yourself?
You can go to my website, jazzrasool.com. We do have an event online on March the 6th where we're looking at something called intentional creativity and the quantum field. It's all about how person can connect into their intention and their state of consciousness, and from there plug into what might be considered their source, their quantum field, and from that how can they actually bring things into this world that maybe originate from other worlds. And it's focused primarily on art and getting it expressed through art, but it can also be used for personal transformation and to make sense of things which might be difficult to put into words.
Yeah, oh, fantastic. That sounds like an amazing event. Penny, your website, and you're here to do a talk tomorrow, I believe.
That's right, at Alternatives at 7 o'clock. That's in St James's Church in Piccadilly. And my website is drpennysartori.com.
And if people are watching this after the event, they can get hold of a recording, hopefully.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's going to be recorded.
That's fantastic. And do you do talks around the world at the moment?
Yes, I do. So if anyone wants me to do a talk, just give me a call, get in touch.
And they can get in touch through your website?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much to all of you. It's been an absolutely wonderful discussion. And so that's it for our discussion today on near-death experiences. And thank you so much for joining us. And do tell us what you think on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. And join us again next time on Hidden Science for some more science from the cutting edge. Goodbye.